Night wraps the bar just outside Camp Pendleton. All friar heat and old beer humming under a worn jukebox. Corporal Jack Dalton leans into the noise with two friends. Drunk pride lifting his chin as he crowds Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan in a corner booth. She holds a ginger ale like a seatbelt and keeps her eyes soft, doing everything she can to stay invisible. He shoves her and throws a wild punch that snaps her jaw, splits her lip, and pulls the sound out of the room while the bartender reaches for the phone. Riley breathes in through her nose and measures him the way she was trained, noting the sway in his stance, the glassy focus, the way ego locks his shoulders. She can end this with basic control from MC Map. One clean movement, and it would be over. But she lets the floor hold her. She keeps her hands open and visible, choosing not to answer pain with more noise, choosing to let the system that protects Marines do its work. Hold on the shine of blood at her lip, the Marine Corps emblem in her wallet, and the question of why discipline wins when payback calls. The bar just outside Camp Pendleton smells like stale beer and fryer grease. With a jukebox that seems older than everyone in the room, young Marines laugh loud after long days. Boots kicked forward and shoulders finally loose. In a back corner sits Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan with a ginger ale. Back to the wall, eyes moving in an easy rhythm that skips across the door and the exits. She keeps her profile low, sleeves plain, badge tucked away, content to let the room forget she is there. She has been back stateside for 6 weeks and works a staff intelligence role with 1st Marine Raider Battalion under MARSOC at Camp Pendleton, while security paperwork for her next rotation moves along. The words on the forms feel dry and exact, which is fine with her, because routine makes a different kind of sense. She breathes steady and counts the pulls of air the way a runner measures distance, reminding herself how ordinary life sounds when no one needs anything from her. Invisible by design, she lets the noise wash past and tries to remember what normal feels like without turning it into a story about the places she will not name. Riley Morgan grew up in Duluth, Minnesota, where snow stayed late and highways felt like family. Her father hauled freight across the Midwest and taught her to listen for what people meant when they went quiet. Her mother worked nights as a nurse at the VA and brought home small stories about veterans carrying weight no one could see. Service settled into the house like another piece of furniture, and Riley learned calm the way other kids learned sports. At 19, she enlisted in the Marine Corps and scored high on the ASVAB, which opened the door to military intelligence. She went to the Defense Language Institute in Monterey and studied Arabic and Pashto, then continued with Humint and analysis training at Fort Huachuca through joint schoolhouse coursework. The classes were practical and exact, built around source handling, ethical elicitation, and pattern recognition that turned noise into usable signals. Those habits shaped how she reads a room, tracks, tone shifts, and stays steady under stress when staying steady matters most. Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan built her edge in quiet classrooms before she ever stepped into noisy rooms. At the Defense Language Institute in Monterey, she drilled Arabic and Pashto until patterns felt natural and small shifts in phrasing meant something. At Fort Huachuca, she learned Humint and analysis with a focus on source handling, elicitacy and ethics, and turning scattered detail into reliable signal. The work prized patience, clear notes, and the habit of listening longer than pride would like. Deployments refined what the schools began. In Afghanistan, she attached to a Marine Expeditionary Unit for about 7 months and built rapport with local contacts who trusted consistency more than charm. In Mosul, she supported targeting with vetted human reporting and learned how a single wrong assumption can echo through a city. In East Africa, she worked alongside a joint task force that included Marines from MARSOC, where her assessments enabled precise actions that kept risk low and outcomes clean. Close quarters confidence came from Marine Corps martial arts program as discipline and control, not showy moves, which is why she values de-escalation and measured force. Every lesson ties to judgment on the ground. Read tone shifts. Map behavior to intent. Choose not to act when restraint does more. The bar near Camp Pendleton carries the smell of stale beer and hot oil, while the jukebox grinds out old songs. Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan picks the corner with her back to the wall and a clear view of the entrance and both exits. A ginger ale sits in her hand and passes as a small piece of normal. 6 weeks back in the States. She works staff intelligence with 1st Marine Raider Battalion under Marsoc at Camp Pendleton, while security paperwork for the next rotation moves quietly through the system. The room is loud and loose, but her breath stays even. In for a count and out for a count. She touches the rim of the glass, scans the room, and lets her shoulders settle without dropping her guard. Small rituals do the work that noise cannot do. From where she sits to how she keeps her phone face down and her ID tucked away, invisible by design. She makes space for other people's stories and lets the night pass without inviting a test or signaling a need to be seen. Corporal Jack Dalton spots Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan at a corner table near Camp Pendleton and lets the alcohol steady his swagger in front of 2 friends. He leans in and presses past normal boundaries, poking at her job and deciding she must be a contractor who shuffles papers while real Marines bleed. He laughs at the idea that she works intelligence and tosses the stolen valor insult like a dare while the room treats it like a joke. Riley keeps her tone even and answers as little as possible. Eyes steady on the door and the exits. Shoulders square but relaxed. When Riley rises to leave, Dalton grabs her wrist and finds nothing to hold. She releases cleanly using a simple control principle taught in the Marine Corps martial arts program. Minimal force. No theatrics. Chair legs scraping as one tips and rattles on the floor. His face hardens as ego takes the wheel and he tells her not to walk away when a Marine is talking. The room tightens in a slow hush while Riley stays measured, keeps her hands visible, and avoids escalation. A quiet professional holding the line on rank, terms, and boundaries with the kind of restraint that comes from training, not fear. Corporal Jack Dalton throws a wild punch that travels on pride more than training. Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan reads his weight and the heavy blur of alcohol, notes how his balance floats over his heels, and lets the strike land on her jaw. She tastes blood and lets gravity do the rest. Settling to the floor with her hands open and visible so no one mistakes her posture, the room goes still as the bartender reaches for the phone, and the clatter of a glass somewhere near the bar sounds louder than it should. Riley counts her pulse and marks positions the way she was taught. Door to left. Exit behind the jukebox. 3 witnesses frozen in place. She knows she could stand and finish it with basic control from the Marine Corps martial arts program. Yet she chooses not to feed a brawl that helps no one. A clean record of assault creates accountability inside the Corps and keeps the lesson where it belongs. Hold on her steady breathing. The salt of blood on her tongue. The sting along the hinge of her jaw. And the faint glint of a Marine Corps emblem in her wallet that says the system works better than any counterpunch she could throw. The Provost Marshal's office steps into the bar just outside Camp Pendleton, with Sergeant Ethan Lawson at the front and a small team at his shoulders. They move with practiced purpose. Palms open, voices steady, and the room settles. Lawson separates the parties and positions a Marine by the door while asking the bartender to pause service and keep patrons in place. Identification comes next as a junior Marine checks common access cards on a handheld tied to deers and confirms names against the system. Lawson reads Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan's information and his tone firms as he addresses Corporal Jack Dalton by rank. He tells Dalton to sit, keep his hands visible, and hold any statements, noting that formal questioning would require advising rights under Article 31B of the UCMJ. He asks Riley if she wants medical care, and she agrees to have injuries documented at the battalion aid station for treatment and evidence. Lawson logs the time, secures brief witness data, and lines up transport, keeping the flow quiet and controlled so the scene stays orderly rather than a spectacle. The battalion aid station is quiet near 11:30 p.m. as a Navy corpsman named Hospitalman Tyler Brooks ushers Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan into an exam room after the bar incident outside Camp Pendleton. He takes vitals with calm hands and documents a split lip and jaw tenderness while the room smells faintly of antiseptic. Brooks photographs the injuries and enters them into the service treatment record, then runs a basic neurological check to screen for concussion risk and pupil response. He cleans the wound, applies an ice pack, and notes the PMO case number for chain of custody so the record stays clean and usable. Their conversation stays measured and professional as Brooks outlines options to notify law enforcement and command or keep the entry medical only for now. Riley chooses medical only while acknowledging she can update the record later. And Brooks acknowledges that decision without pressure. He gives discharge instructions and return precautions for worsening headache, nausea, dizziness, vision changes, or trouble speaking, and suggests follow-up if jaw pain persists or chewing becomes difficult. She signs the paperwork, pockets a copy, and steps into the cool corridor while Brooks logs the time, closes the chart, and coordinates the calm handoff to the next step. Inside a quiet exam room at the battalion aid station, the clock reads 11:45 p.m., and fluorescent hum feels softer than night outside. Sergeant Ethan Lawson from the Provost Marshal's office steps in, closes the door, and takes a seat where he can see the exit and the chart. He keeps his voice low as he notes the split lip, jaw tenderness, photos, vitals, and the PMO case number. He mentions that Corporal Jack Dalton has prior alcohol-related counseling, and that patterns like this can escalate if no one interrupts them. Careful to inform without steering, Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan weighs her options with steady breathing and clear eyes. She asks for a path that uses leadership inside the unit rather than a criminal complaint, and requests Lawson coordinate a meeting with command and a staff judge advocate present, so the process stays within the UCMJ framework. Lawson agrees and notes that her medical documentation and the initial report already preserve evidence if command needs it. The room settles as she chooses measured accountability over retaliation, and a small nod between a seasoned staff sergeant and a steady PMO NCO signals the turn from incident to solution. Base Legal hosts a small meeting that feels orderly and measured. Captain Mark Ellison represents the battalion with Staff Sergeant Paul Rivera present as the platoon sergeant. Captain Amy Chen from the Staff Judge Advocate sits alongside Sergeant Ethan Lawson from the Provost Marshal's office, and Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan takes a seat with a calm posture. Everyone addresses rank correctly and keeps the tone professional and steady. Options within the Uniform Code of Military Justice are laid out in clear terms that fit Marine Corps practice. Assault under Article 128 could move toward a criminal investigation and possibly court-martial actions depending on command decision. Non-judicial punishment known as office hours under Article 15 could bring loss of pay along with reduction and restriction. Command-directed corrective action could include mandatory counseling, temporary removal from any leadership duties, and a formal written apology entered in the Marines' record and delivered to Riley Morgan's command. Riley speaks briefly about respect, competence, and trust inside the unit. She steps back and lets leadership decide so the process remains clean and accountable. No one is pressured to speak beyond what is appropriate, and notes are kept simple and factual. The tension in the room comes from standards and responsibility rather than drama. Outside Base Legal, the decision point arrives with calm voices and clear terms. Command presents Corporal Jack Dalton with two paths that fit Marine Corps practice. One path is NJP, known as office hours under Article 15 with loss of pay, possible reduction, and restriction. The other path is command-directed corrective action that includes mandatory counseling, temporary removal from any leadership duties, and a formal written apology entered in his record and delivered to Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan's command. Riley does not push for assault under Article 128. She lets leadership decide and keeps the focus on accountability rather than retaliation, knowing her medical documentation and the PMO report remain on file if the behavior repeats. Dalton accepts the corrective plan while command sets expectations for conduct, alcohol use, and respect inside the unit. Riley steps away with quiet relief and steady purpose. satisfied that standards have been upheld and that the lesson sits where it belongs. On base, the story of the bar near Camp Pendleton moves fast through the grapevine, bent at the edges but still carrying the core truth. It shifts from table talk to smoke pit chat to a nod in a hallway. Details swollen, timelines crooked, names shuffled. What stays is simple, that a drunk junior Marine hit a staff sergeant and the system answered without a scene. The noise fades into routine, while people remember the parts that matter. Sergeant Ethan Lawson shares quiet updates that feel steady rather than dramatic. Corporal Jack Dalton starts asking more questions, listens during briefings, shows up early and sober, and cuts off cheap jokes about intelligence Marines or women before they get air. His formal apology arrives in writing as required, and he follows through with counseling and temporary removal from any leadership role without theatrics or pushback. Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan stays off stage and focused on work with 1st Marine Raider Battalion under MARSOC at Camp Pendleton. Chooses not to return to the bar, and lets the culture adjust by small acts that stack up over time for the unit and for the people who carry its name on long, quiet nights too. Orders arrive after the clearance update, and they point Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan toward a joint task force in the Pacific. At 1st Marine Raider Battalion in Camp Pendleton, she begins out processing with a checklist that feels familiar and clean. Supply inspects her gear while she turns in what is excess and signs for what must travel. Medical and dental readiness are verified with quick exams and a final stamp that clears her to deploy. She walks to S2 and closes open actions with tidy notes that protect sources and methods. Intelligence packets are scrubbed of anything sensitive and handed off with quiet reminders about custody and access. She reviews travel orders, confirms embarkation data, and checks itinerary details twice so no one loses time. Back at her place, she folds uniforms, tapes a small list to the top of a Pelican case, and sits for a minute with the soft buzz of a phone that has already gone silent. The sun drops over the lot as she crosses to her car with a small bag and a steady pace. The work ahead will never make headlines, and that is fine. Competence is its own story when a team needs you to show up. She locks the door and breathes once more before the next start. Her last evening stateside is quiet and clean. Paperwork stacked away. Phone screen dim. Staff Sergeant Riley Morgan calls her mother from a small room that smells like laundry and coffee. They trade simple news about her father's route, the long nights and early mornings, and her sister's nursing school applications that keep getting more real. She glances at a packed bag by the door and feels how the house holds its breath when everything is ready. They talk about Duluth weather and whether the lake will throw wind at the weekend. Her mother reminds her to take care of herself out there, and Riley promises she will, with the kind of promise that sits deeper than words. She thinks about Corporal Jack Dalton and the second chance now sitting in his hands, knowing his next choices will define the Marine he becomes. The call ends with warmth and a steady kind of trust that travels better than anything she can pack. Riley steps outside into evening light that slides across the pavement and fades toward the base. The next mission will not ask for headlines, only presence and care for the team. She breathes once and feels ready. If this story reaches you, share a time when leadership meant restraint and respect,